Yorkshire, November 1944. Dense fog shrouded Camp 18 at Featherston Park, transforming dawn into something leaden and ambiguous. A mirror to the terror coiling inside Anna Richter's chest. Two British medical officers advanced toward her barracks, their boots grinding against gravel with a sound that pierced the oppressive silence. Behind them, a military ambulance sat idling, its exhaust weaving ghostly patterns into the mist. Anna pressed her newborn daughter tighter against her body, sensing the miniature heartbeat hammering against her own. Both racing with dread, she struggled to conceal. The officers delivered their message in measured English. She comprehended fragments, watched them gesture toward documentation, toward the waiting vehicle, toward regulations printed in a language beyond her grasp. Her daughter had existed outside the womb for merely 3 days, impossibly small, terrifyingly fragile. Medical complications, they explained. Hospital required, they stated. But mothers could not escort infants to civilian facilities. Security protocols forbade it. She would be forced to release her grip. 72 hours hence, what returned would demolish every assumption she'd constructed about adversaries, about maternal bonds, about what it meant to choose humanity when regulations dictated otherwise. Anna's ordeal commenced 9 months earlier, February 1944, when the transport vessel bearing her from occupied France docked at Liverpool. 28 years old, carrying life within her, widowed before she'd properly assumed the title of wife. Her husband Klaus had perished at Monte Cassino in January, obliterated by artillery before learning she harbored his child. She had labored as a translator in a German administrative office in Lyon, trapped in France as resistance forces intensified and the Reich commenced evacuating non-essential personnel. British forces had captured her group during the chaotic withdrawal. A pregnant woman among clerks and minor functionaries who had never discharged weapons, never orchestrated strategic decisions, only processed paperwork for an empire disintegrating faster than anyone publicly acknowledged. The regime's propaganda had conditioned her for British savagery. Tales of Churchill's bloodlust, of English hatred so absolute it would transform even expectant mothers into targets. She had absorbed accounts of female prisoners worked unto death, of medical care deliberately withheld, of systematic cruelty disguised in the vocabulary of military necessity. She had cradled her expanding belly and steeled herself for the worst, prepared for treatment befitting enemies who merited no mercy simply because they'd been born German. Instead, processing at Liverpool proved methodical and exhaustive, yet not vindictive. Medical examinations that genuinely assessed her health, documentation completed with bureaucratic precision that felt more tedious than hostile. British officers who appeared exhausted rather than cruel. A system architected around efficiency rather than punishment, around Geneva Convention obligations rather than vengeance. Then the train journey north. Hours traversing English countryside that bore no resemblance to the bombed wasteland she'd anticipated. Through villages with churches still standing, past farms where livestock grazed in tranquility, alongside Britons who observed German prisoners with weary curiosity rather than murderous hatred. She pressed her palm to her belly, detecting movement within, attempting to reconcile the England she witnessed with the England she'd been conditioned to fear. Camp 18 sprawled across 120 acres of Northumberland land near Featherston Park. Constructed in 1943, it had been expanded to accommodate the swelling flood of German prisoners from every theater of war. By early 1944, it contained over 2,800 men in the main compound, and in a separate, smaller facility designed with unexpected consideration. 23 German women and their dependents. The women's section differed from the men's compound. Modified barracks with partitioned spaces for families. A common room where women congregated to sew, to converse in German, to preserve fragments of ordinary existence. A medical station staffed by British personnel who treated German patients with the same clinical detachment they'd offer anyone. Not kindness precisely, but competence. Not cruelty either. Anna was assigned to Hut 4. She shared the space with 5 other women. 3 with young children, 2 elderly. All caught in the machinery of war's conclusion. 14 people total in a structure meant for 10. Personal space became a luxury from another lifetime. Privacy was negotiated through whispers and averted gazes. Yet they possessed cots. They possessed warmth. They possessed food that was bland but adequate. They possessed safety from the chaos consuming Germany. The other women assisted her in preparing for birth. Frau Weber, 62, who had delivered 4 children in peacetime Munich, dispensed advice about breathing and positioning. Greta Hoffmann, 31, whose toddler son played with blocks fashioned from scrap wood, shared the baby clothes her boy had outgrown. Marie Adler, 25, barely more than a girl herself, helped Anna walk the perimeter fence when her back ached, speaking about hopes for after the war, after imprisonment, after this strange suspended existence concluded. Anna's pregnancy advanced under the vigilant eye of the camp's medical staff. Dr. Peter Thornton, a British Army captain in his mid-40s, examined her weekly, his manner professional and detached. He spoke deliberately so she could comprehend basic English medical terminology. Week 26, baby's heartbeat strong. Week 30, position favorable. Week 34, slight concern regarding size, monitor closely. He never smiled, never offered comfort beyond clinical reassurance, but he was thorough. That thoroughness mattered more than warmth. In October, as autumn stripped leaves from trees and rendered the camp even more isolated, Anna experienced the first contractions. False labor, Thornton determined after examination. 2 more weeks, possibly 3. Rest required, stress minimized, preparation necessary. The women in Hut 4 organized themselves around her needs. Frau Weber assumed Anna's assigned work duties, sorting supplies in the camp warehouse. Marie brought extra blankets, extra water. Greta's toddler was kept quiet during Anna's afternoon rests. An impossible task the child approached with earnest determination that typically lasted 15 minutes before he forgot and commenced singing. On November 11, 1944, at 0230 hours, Anna's water broke. The pain arrived fast, overwhelming, unlike anything she'd been told to anticipate. Frau Weber ran for the British Guard stationed at the women's compound entrance. Her German urgent and panicked enough that language barriers dissolved into universal understanding. Woman in labor. Help needed immediately. Dr. Thornton arrived within 20 minutes, accompanied by a British nurse, Lieutenant Helen Bradford, and 2 medical corpsmen carrying equipment. They transformed the corner of Hut 4 into an impromptu delivery room, hanging blankets for privacy, positioning lamps, preparing instruments with efficiency suggesting this wasn't their first birth in less than ideal circumstances. Labor persisted 14 hours. Anna screamed in German, in French, in sounds that transcended language. Frau Weber gripped her hand, translated between Anna's German agony and Thornton's English instructions. Helen Bradford, stern-faced and 30-something, wiped Anna's forehead with cool cloths, murmured reassurances in English that Anna understood through tone rather than words. At 1,647 hours on November 12th, Anna's daughter was born. Too small. That was Thornton's immediate assessment. For pounds 8 ounces, breathing labored, color not quite right. He worked swiftly, clearing airways, checking reflexes, his movements economical and focused. The baby cried. A thin wail that sounded too weak, too fragile. Helen Bradford wrapped the infant in blankets, placed her briefly against Anna's chest. Skin-to-skin contact, she explained through gesture. Mother's warmth helped stabilize. Anna held her daughter for perhaps 10 minutes, felt the tiny body against her own, counted miniature fingers, traced the curve of a cheek too delicate, stared at eyes that couldn't quite focus yet. She had no name prepared. Klaus had wanted to wait until birth, had superstitions about naming before seeing the child. Klaus was dead. Anna was alone. She whispered Liesel to the tiny being in her arms. Little Elizabeth, her daughter. Thornton reclaimed the baby, examined her more thoroughly. His expression shifted toward something grim. This infant requires specialized neonatal care. Our medical station isn't equipped for premature births with respiratory complications. Helen Bradford understood immediately what he wasn't articulating directly. The baby needed a hospital, a genuine one with incubators and specialists and resources Camp 18 couldn't provide. The request ascended the chain. Camp commandant contacted, district military authority notified, approval sought for transporting a German infant to Hexham Hospital. the nearest civilian facility with appropriate neonatal capabilities. Regulations were consulted, precedents examined. The Geneva Convention mandated adequate medical care for prisoners and their dependents. What constituted adequate remained subject to interpretation, but infant mortality due to inadequate facilities was clearly unacceptable. Authorization came through within 8 hours. The baby would be transported to Hexham Hospital. She would receive care commensurate with her medical needs. And Anna would remain at Camp 18. The regulations were explicit. German POW mothers could not accompany infants to civilian hospitals. Security concerns, the complexity of guarding prisoners in public facilities, the simple impossibility of maintaining proper custody while allowing maternal care. Thornton explained this through a translator, one of the German-speaking British officers assigned to camp administration. His tone was apologetic yet firm. Your daughter needs hospital care. We cannot provide it here. She will be taken to Hexham. The nurses there are excellent. She will receive proper treatment. But you cannot go with her. Regulations forbid it. You will receive daily updates. You will be reunited when she's medically cleared for return. Anna listened and felt reality fracture. Neen, she said in German, then in broken English. No, I must go. She needs mother. Baby needs mother. She tried to make them comprehend that Liesel was 3 days old, that newborns recognize their mother's heartbeat, that separation now would cause trauma, that regulations couldn't possibly matter more than an infant's need for maternal presence. But regulations were regulations. At 1,100 hours on November 15th, an ambulance arrived at the women's compound. Helen Bradford would accompany the infant medical transport with appropriate monitoring. Anna was brought from Hut 4, permitted to see her daughter one final time before transport. Liesel lay in a makeshift incubator, a wooden box lined with hot water bottles and blankets designed to maintain warmth during the 40-minute journey to Hexham. Her breathing was rapid, shallow. Her tiny chest worked too hard for too little air. Anna reached in, touched one impossibly small hand. Liesel's fingers curled reflexively around Anna's index finger with a grip that was simultaneously powerful and heartbreakingly fragile. Helen Bradford stood beside the incubator, her expression professionally neutral, yet her eyes suggesting something else. Understanding, perhaps, sympathy she couldn't articulate within military protocols. She placed one hand on Anna's shoulder, brief pressure that communicated what words wouldn't. I'll take care of her. I know this is impossible. I'll do everything I can. The ambulance doors closed. Anna stood in the November cold and watched it pull away, watched until it disappeared beyond the camp gates, until nothing remained but tire tracks in muddy ground and the absence that filled her chest like physical weight. She returned to Hut 4 and collapsed on her cot, staring at the space where Liesel's makeshift cradle had been, at blankets still arranged for an infant who was gone, at evidence of a daughter who had existed in her arms for less than 72 hours before being taken by people speaking a language Anna barely understood for reasons she grasped intellectually but couldn't accept emotionally. That evening she didn't eat, couldn't. Frau Weber brought soup. Marie offered bread. Anna stared at both and felt nothing except the physical ache of milk coming in. Her body producing sustenance for a baby who wasn't there to receive it. The other women tried to comfort her with whispers in German and awkward pats on her back. Their sympathy was genuine but useless. Her daughter was gone, taken by the British to some unknown facility, separated by miles and language and the cruel arithmetic of regulations that prioritized security protocols over a mother's need to protect her 3-day-old child. Hexham General Hospital occupied a Victorian-era building on the town's western edge. Built in 1888, it was respectable by provincial standards, electricity throughout, running water, actual medical equipment beyond what military field stations could offer. The staff had been notified of the incoming German infant. There had been resistance. Some nurses objected to treating enemy nationals when British boys were dying across the channel. Others argued that babies were babies regardless of which side their fathers had fought for. The hospital matron, Agnes Shaw, made the final decision. The infant would be admitted to the neonatal ward. Security would be maintained by the military police escort. Treatment would follow medical necessity, nothing more, nothing less. Liesel was placed in a proper incubator, glass enclosed with temperature controls, Oxygen supplementation available. Helen Bradford remained for the initial assessment, providing what medical history existed for a 3-day-old whose mother had received minimal prenatal care in a prisoner of war camp. Premature by approximately 4 weeks. Respiratory distress present from birth. Mother's health adequate but stressed throughout pregnancy. Father deceased before infant's birth. The attending physician was Dr. James Mitchell, 47 years old, veteran of the last war, returned to civilian practice afterward, too old for combat duty this time but young enough to work exhausting shifts in understaffed hospitals. He examined Liesel with practiced efficiency, listening to lungs that weren't expanding properly, observing skin color that suggested insufficient oxygen, noting reflexes that were present but weak. This infant has underdeveloped lungs. She needs supplemental oxygen, careful monitoring, and time for her respiratory system to mature. The next 72 hours are critical. If she stabilizes, prognosis is favorable. If she deteriorates, we have limited interventions available for a patient this small. The nurse assigned to Liesel's care was Margaret Price, 38 years old, career nursing professional, unmarried by choice or circumstance, dedicated to her work with intensity that substituted for the family she'd never had. She approached the incubator expecting to find a German infant requiring clinical treatment. Another patient in an endless stream of patients during wartime's chaos. Instead, she found a tiny human fighting for every breath. Liesel's chest rose and fell with visible effort. Each inhalation a struggle, each exhalation insufficient. Her eyes were closed, her fists clenched, her body engaged in the fundamental battle for survival. Margaret stood beside the incubator and felt something shift inside her professional detachment. This wasn't an enemy infant. This was simply an infant who needed help desperately, and whose mother wasn't there to provide comfort during the fight. She adjusted the oxygen flow, checked temperature regulation, made notes on the monitoring chart. Then she did something technically unnecessary. She opened the incubator's access port and placed her hand inside, resting fingertips against Liesel's palm. The baby's hand opened reflexively, then closed around Margaret's finger with that same instinctive grip Anna had felt during their last moment together. Margaret held position for perhaps 30 seconds, letting the infant feel human touch, providing connection when connection was all she could offer. The next 48 hours passed in intensive monitoring. Liesel's oxygen levels fluctuated, stable for hours, then dropping suddenly, requiring constant adjustment. Her temperature regulation was unstable, the incubator's controls compensating for a body too small to maintain adequate warmth independently. She fed poorly from the bottle, weak sucking reflex, requiring patient coaxing for every ounce of formula. Margaret worked 12-hour shifts, then stayed beyond them, unable to leave while Liesel remained critical, unable to explain to herself why this particular infant mattered more than professional distance should allow. On the evening of November 17th, Margaret did something that violated hospital policy. She lifted Liesel from the incubator for kangaroo care, placing the infant against her chest, skin-to-skin contact beneath her uniform, maintaining warmth through body heat rather than mechanical heating. She sat in the chair beside the incubator and simply held this tiny German baby, feeling each struggled breath, counting heartbeats that were too rapid but at least consistent, providing the maternal contact policy said was medically unnecessary but Margaret's instincts insisted was crucial. Dr. Mitchell found her there an hour later. He paused in the doorway, observed the scene, then approached quietly. "That's not standard protocol, Nurse Price." Margaret met his eyes. "No, doctor, but her oxygen saturation improved by 4 percentage points since I've been holding her. You can verify on the chart." Mitchell checked the documentation. The improvement was real, measurable, undeniable. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled up a second chair and sat down. "Her mother is at the POW camp. Regulations forbid bringing her here. This baby has been separated from maternal contact since birth, essentially." Margaret adjusted her hold on Liesel, felt the infant settle more fully against her chest. "She's fighting so hard, doctor, but she's fighting alone. That's not how newborns are meant to survive." Mitchell studied the sleeping infant, the nurse holding her with careful intensity. "The baby's mother should be here. This is medically unsound, separating them." Margaret looked at him directly. Can you do something about it? Mitchell considered. Hospital policy doesn't forbid visitor access to patients. Military security protocols do. But if I were to write a medical recommendation stating that maternal presence would significantly improve patient outcomes, that might carry weight with whoever makes these decisions. Do you believe it would improve outcomes? Mitchell nodded slowly. Yes, I do. Newborns recognize their mother's voice, their heartbeat, their scent. They're evolutionarily designed to bond immediately after birth. This infant has been denied that fundamental connection during her most vulnerable period. I can't prove it would cure her respiratory distress, but I can state with professional certainty that it wouldn't harm her recovery, and would likely support it. Then write the recommendation, Margaret said. Make them justify why regulations matter more than an infant's chance at survival. The formal request was drafted that night. Dr. Mitchell composed it with careful medical precision, documenting Liesel's condition, noting the improvement during kangaroo care, referencing research on maternal-infant bonding and neonatal outcomes. He concluded with direct language. It is the medical opinion of the attending physician that permitting the patient's mother's supervised visitation would constitute appropriate medical care and potentially improve clinical outcomes. Current policy separating mother and infant appears contraindicated from a medical perspective. The request went to the hospital administrator, who forwarded it to the military liaison officer, who contacted Camp 18's commandant, who had to clear it with regional military command. The bureaucracy moved with surprising speed, perhaps because the request was unusual enough to warrant actual decision-making rather than automatic denial. Perhaps because someone in the chain recognized the fundamental absurdity of regulations that separated 3-day-old infants from their mothers for security reasons. On November 18th, authorization came through. Anna Richter, German POW, would be transported to Hexham General Hospital under armed guard to visit her daughter during her medical recovery. Duration as long as medically necessary. Security, 2 military police present at all times. Restrictions, mother confined to neonatal ward, no access to other hospital areas, no interaction with civilian patients or staff beyond medical necessity. At Camp 18, Dr. Thornton delivered the news to Anna through the translator. She was sitting on her cot, had been sitting there for 3 days, moving only for basic necessities, existing in the suspended state of mothers separated from newborns, physically present but emotionally absent. The translator spoke in German. You will see your daughter tomorrow. The British are permitting you to visit the hospital. Anna didn't understand at first. The words were German but made no sense. Regulations forbid it. She had been told regulations were absolute. The translator repeated it. A doctor at the hospital requested permission for you to visit. The military approved it. You will go to Hexham in the morning. Anna began crying. The other women in Hut 4 gathered around her, crying with her. This impossible thing. This mercy from people they'd been taught to hate. This breach in the wall between captor and prisoner that suggested humanity could survive even in wartime's machinery. The transport left Camp 18 at 0900 hours on November 19th. Anna sat in the back of a military lorry with 2 armed guards who didn't speak German and didn't attempt conversation. She had been awake since before dawn, had washed as thoroughly as limited facilities allowed, had smoothed her prison uniform until the fabric couldn't get any smoother, had tried to make herself presentable for a daughter who was 4 days old and wouldn't remember this moment. But Anna needed to be clean, needed to be proper, needed to be worthy of seeing Liesel again. The drive to Hexham took 45 minutes. Anna stared out at the English countryside, alien territory that looked nothing like Germany, rolling hills that were green despite November's cold, stone walls dividing fields with ancient precision, villages that seemed impossibly intact compared to the bombed cities she'd fled. She tried to prepare herself for seeing Liesel, tried to imagine what 4 days in British custody had done to her daughter, tried not to let propaganda's warnings about English cruelty overwhelm her hope that maybe, possibly, her baby was being treated with something approaching care. At the hospital, she was processed through security, given an identification badge, briefed on restrictions through the translator who had accompanied the transport. She barely heard the words, only understood. You can see your daughter now. Follow me. Margaret was waiting in the neonatal ward. She gestured to the incubator where Liesel lay. Tiny body surrounded by glass and medical equipment, tubes and monitors that looked terrifying to Anna's untrained eyes. Then Margaret stepped back, creating space, understanding that this moment needed no medical personnel present. Only a mother and the child she'd been forced to abandon. Anna approached the incubator, stopped breathing. Her daughter here, real, alive. Liesel's eyes were closed. Her breathing still labored, but better than 3 days ago. Her color improved from the gray-tinged complexion Anna remembered. Medical equipment beeped and hummed, marking heartbeat and oxygen and all the quantifiable measures of survival. Anna placed both hands on the incubator's glass, as close to touching as regulations allowed. Then Margaret did something unexpected. She opened the incubator's access panels, reached in, and carefully lifted Liesel out. She turned to Anna and placed the infant in her arms. The guard stepped forward instinctively, then stopped, uncertain if this violated security protocols, unwilling to intervene in something that felt too fundamentally human to interrupt with regulations. Anna held her daughter and felt the world reconstruct itself. Liesel was warm, breathing, present. Anna pulled her close, felt the rapid heartbeat against her chest, counted each inhalation, each exhalation, each proof of continued existence. She began crying, silent tears that fell on Liesel's blanket while she whispered in German all the things she'd been unable to say for 3 days. "I'm here. Mama's here. You're not alone. I won't leave you again." Margaret watched from the doorway, tears running down her own face. The guards watched with expressions that suggested they hadn't expected their duty to involve witnessing this kind of reunion, hadn't anticipated that enemy prisoners could love their children with the same desperate intensity British mothers did. Dr. Mitchell appeared briefly, observed the scene, nodded with satisfaction, and quietly left. Sometimes medicine required acknowledging that healing involved more than medications and procedures. Anna stayed with Liesel constantly for the next 4 days. She slept on a cot placed beside the incubator, woke every 2 hours to feed her daughter, learned basic English medical terms through necessity and repetition. Margaret taught her kangaroo care technique, showed her how to position Liesel against her chest for optimal skin-to-skin contact, explained that body heat and heartbeat recognition helped premature infants regulate their own systems. Anna held her daughter for hours, singing German lullabies that made the British nurses pause outside the ward, listening to music in a language they were supposed to consider enemy sound. Liesel's condition improved dramatically with her mother present. Her oxygen requirements decreased from 40% supplementation to 28%. Her feeding improved, sucking reflex growing stronger, weight beginning to increase. Her sleep patterns stabilized, cycles of rest and waking that aligned with when Anna held her versus when she lay alone in the incubator. Margaret documented every measurement meticulously, creating evidence that maternal presence hadn't been sentimental indulgence but medical necessity. Dr. Mitchell reviewed the charts on November 23 and felt vindicated in his decision to request Anna's presence. "Medical science," he wrote in his daily report, "sometimes requires acknowledging that human connection constitutes therapeutic intervention. The patient's marked improvement correlates directly with maternal presence, supporting the recommendation that separation of newborns from their mothers should be avoided whenever possible, regardless of the mother's prisoner of war status." Before Anna returned to Camp 18, Margaret gave her something that violated about 6 different regulations. A knitted blanket, soft yellow wool, made by Margaret's own hands over the previous 4 evenings. She pressed it into Anna's arms along with Liesel. "For your daughter, so she has something that's hers. Something made just for her." Anna stared at the blanket, at the British nurse who had fought for her daughter's right to have her mother present, who had held Liesel when Anna couldn't, who had demonstrated that enemies could choose to be something else when confronted with an infant's need. She tried to find English words adequate for gratitude this size. "Thank you. You save her. You save us both." Margaret shook her head. "I just did what was medically appropriate. Any decent nurse would have done the same." "No." Anna was firm, her English broken but emphatic. "You fight for us. You see baby first, then see German. That matter very much." They embraced awkwardly. Prisoner and nurse, German and British, 2 women separated by war, but united by shared understanding that children deserved protection regardless of which nation claimed them. Back at Camp 18, the story spread rapidly. The German mother whose newborn had been taken to hospital. The British nurse who demanded regulations be changed. The reunion that transcended nationality. The other prisoners heard it as evidence that the British, despite being enemies, were capable of unexpected compassion. That propaganda about English barbarism had been lies designed to make Germans fight harder. The British guards heard it as evidence that maintaining humanity during war was possible, that regulations existed to serve people rather than the reverse, that sometimes the right thing was obvious even when protocol said otherwise. In December, as Liesl gained weight and strength, Anna received something unusual. A letter from Margaret, delivered through official channels, approved by censors, translated by the camp's German-speaking administrator. Dear Mrs. Richter, I hope this letter finds you and Liesl in continued good health. I wanted you to know that caring for your daughter was one of the most meaningful experiences of my nursing career. She reminded me why I entered this profession. To heal, to comfort, to help regardless of circumstances or nationality. I know the war will end eventually and you'll return to Germany. I hope you find your country rebuilt and peaceful, offering Liesl the future she deserves. I hope she grows strong and healthy and never remembers these first difficult days. Tell her that an English nurse will always remember her, will always wish her well, will always be grateful for the reminder that children are never enemies, regardless of what war their parents were caught in. With warm regards and best wishes, Margaret Price, RN. Anna kept the letter carefully stored among her few possessions, read it through the translator multiple times, trying to understand how an enemy could write with such kindness. She composed a response, though she wasn't certain it would be delivered. Dear Nurse Margaret, thank you for everything you did for my Liesl. Thank you for seeing her as a baby first, not as German. Thank you for fighting to bring me to her when regulations said I couldn't come. You saved more than her life. You saved her from the fear of being alone, from the trauma of separation during her most vulnerable time. I was told the British were cruel. You showed me the British were people who could choose compassion when indifference would have been easier. I will tell Liesl about you for the rest of my life. I will teach her that enemies in war can be friends in humanity, that nationality matters less than character, that the woman who fought for her right to have her mother present was English, and that should never be forgotten. With gratitude I cannot fully express. Anna. The letters crossed through military postal systems. Two women from enemy nations communicating about babies and healing and the possibility of seeing each other as human despite the context that labeled them adversaries. Repatriation began in spring 1945. Germany surrendered in May. The logistics of returning thousands of prisoners to their homeland commenced. Anna and Liesl were scheduled for transport in June, Liverpool to Hamburg, then whatever awaited in occupied Germany. Before leaving Camp 18, Anna was given something unexpected. A package delivered through official channels containing items for Liesl. A collection of baby clothes, British-made, sized for a growing infant. The yellow blanket Margaret had given her, now accompanied by a matching hat. A photograph of Margaret in her nursing uniform, standing beside the incubator that had housed Liesl, with a note on the back, so she can know the face of someone who cared for her. Each gift represented something larger than the object itself. Evidence that compassion could survive war's hatred, that individuals could choose humanity when systems demanded otherwise. Anna and Liesl crossed back to Germany in early June, joining millions of displaced persons trying to reconstruct lives from fragments. Hamburg was devastated, barely recognizable. But Anna's sister had survived, had a small apartment in the outskirts, had room for a widow and her infant daughter. They settled into post-war poverty, rebuilding slowly, existing day-to-day in a Germany that bore no resemblance to the country Anna had left. But Anna had something others didn't, evidence that enemies could be merciful, that nationality didn't determine humanity, that even in war's worst moments, people could choose to protect children regardless of which side those children belonged to. Margaret and Anna corresponded for 32 years. Letters crossed regularly between Yorkshire and Hamburg, becoming more than updates on Liesl's growth. They became friendship forged in an impossible week, when war made them enemies but circumstance made them allies in protecting an infant. Margaret visited Germany in 1963. a holiday tour through Bavaria that detoured to Hamburg specifically to meet Anna and Liesel in person for the first time since the hospital. Liesel was 19, studying medicine at university. Speaking fluent English, she'd learned partially from reading her mother's letters from the British nurse who'd saved her life. They met in Anna's modest apartment, drank coffee, talked about that November in 1944 when everything had been terrible and uncertain. But humanity had somehow prevailed anyway. "You saved my daughter," Anna said. The same words she tried to express 18 years earlier. Margaret shook her head, older now but still recognizing echoes of the desperate mother she'd fought for. "I just insisted that regulations not separate you. You saved her. A mother's love did that." No. Anna was as firm as she'd been in 1944. "A mother's love was useless if you had not fought to let me use it. You chose to see us as humans, not enemies. That choice changed everything." They embraced. Two elderly women who'd been on opposite sides of history's worst conflict, now united by shared memory of choosing compassion when hatred would have been sanctioned, when indifference would have been easier, when humanity required breaking rules designed to keep people separated. Margaret Price died in 1978 at age 72. Her obituary mentioned a distinguished nursing career, service during wartime, dedication to neonatal care. It didn't mention a German infant in Hexham Hospital, the mother she demanded be brought to her baby, the regulations she'd insisted shouldn't matter more than a newborn's need for maternal presence. But her family knew, and they told the story at her funeral, how Nurse Margaret had looked at a German prisoner's baby and seen only an infant needing help, how she'd fought protocol that separated mothers from newborns, how she demonstrated that healing required acknowledging human connection as medical necessity. Anna Richter died in 1989 at age 73. She died in Hamburg, surrounded by her daughter and grandchildren, having rebuilt a life in a Germany transformed beyond recognition from the one that had collapsed in 1945. Her last words, according to Liesel, were in English, a language she'd learned enough of to honor the woman who'd saved her daughter. "Tell Margaret I kept the blanket. Tell her I never forgot." The yellow blanket was found among Anna's possessions, worn thin from decades of handling but still intact, still yellow. Liesel kept it, eventually donated it to a museum documenting the German POW experience in Britain, where it sits now behind glass, evidence of an impossible friendship, of a nurse who demanded regulations bend to accommodate an infant's needs, of a mother who learned that enemies could be merciful. The story became part of historical record. Researchers studying POW treatment cite it as an example of how individual compassion could transcend systematic enmity. Medical historians reference it when discussing the evolution of neonatal care policies. But the deeper meaning isn't in academic analysis. It's in the simple fact that two women placed on opposite sides by war refused to let that placement define their choices. That a nurse saw a struggling infant and demanded her mother be present regardless of security protocols. That a prisoner learned mercy from people she'd been taught to hate. The neonatal ward where it happened has been renovated multiple times. Nothing remains of the space where Anna first held Liesel in the British hospital. But in Hexham General's archives, there's documentation, medical charts showing Liesel's improvement with maternal presence, Dr. Mitchell's recommendation that regulations be changed, Margaret's nursing notes documenting every feeding, every temperature check, every moment of the 4 days that rewrote what Anna understood about enemies. 72 hours after British officers took her 3-day-old daughter away, they brought Anna to her. That reversal, that unexpected mercy, represented everything complicated about war, occupation, and the possibility of maintaining humanity when circumstances conspire to strip it away. The regulations said separate them. The regulations prioritized security over maternal need, proper protocols over infant psychology. But one nurse said no. One doctor agreed. One bureaucratic chain chose to authorize compassion over convenience. And one infant recovered, surrounded by her mother instead of alone, learned through experience too early to remember consciously that some enemies choose kindness, that nationality matters less than character, that sometimes the most important victories happen in hospital wards rather than battlefields. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is insist that rules designed to keep people apart should yield to needs that unite them. Sometimes what happens 72 hours later rewrites everything you thought you knew about who your enemies are. And sometimes the impossible becomes possible because someone refuses to accept that regulations matter more than a mother's right to hold her newborn daughter. that security concerns outweigh an infant's need for maternal heartbeat, that being enemies in war means abandoning humanity in all circumstances. The yellow blanket remains. The letters remain. The historical record remains. Evidence that in November 1944, in a British hospital in Hexham, a German prisoner and an English nurse became allies in the simplest, most profound cause imaginable. Protecting a child too small to understand war, too vulnerable to survive alone, too human to be defined by her mother's nationality. And in that alliance, however temporary, however constrained by war's context, they demonstrated something that still matters, that individual choice can transcend systematic hatred, that compassion can survive even when everything around it demands cruelty,